How fucked are we?
Oh, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, Peter, we're probably at about 8.5 right now. Authoritarians always move really quickly to close down everywhere, wherever they are. It's, you get rid of independent public interest media as quickly as you can. The Overton window doesn't exist anymore in the United States. It's basically the big hole in the roof. So anyone can say anything. This is all part of where propaganda becomes policy. And I think that's the thing which is truly terrifying. The pushback can come through a kind of collective ingenuity. What you have to hope is that it's not too late for that. The BBC had Nigel Farage on Question Time, on news bulletins. They had him when he had no political power at all, and he was interesting because of how his rhetoric and stance was pulling the Conservative Party to the right. And it does feel like it might be a kind of quite low budget version of what's happened in the United States, but the patterns are almost exactly the same.
Welcome back to Democracy for Sale. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Emily Bell. She's Professor of Journalism at Columbia University and Director of the Tau Centre for Digital Journalism. And she's also one of the most perspicacious and interesting voices on the media, not just in the US, but also in the UK. And so I'm just really, really honoured. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Emily.
Thank you, Peter. That's a very generous introduction. I'm not sure I'm any of the voices at the moment because I work for Columbia University. I'm not a citizen of the United States. So what I've been saying in the past 6 to 9 months has been somewhat less than usual, but we might get into some of the reasons for that.
I really hope we do. It's one of the reasons I'm so pleased you're talking to us because, I think it's such a vital conversation to be having. And I guess, one of the places I wanted to start with it is someone who people are hearing a lot about at the moment, Larry Ellison. He's the founder of Oracle. He's one of Trump's biggest backers. His company, through Oracle, he's about to control TikTok's US data. His son controls Paramount. There's a Paramount Skydance merger that went through. We've been reporting on Democracy for Sale along with our colleagues at Lighthouse Reports about Oracle's huge amount of funding for the Tony Blair Institute, £257 million and counting over the last couple of years. And I just feel like Ellison is actually just such an incredibly interesting character to almost open up this discussion about this connection between media and politics. It feels like it's changing really quickly in ways that in some ways are novel, in some ways aren't. And, Ellison isn't a traditional media baron, I guess, but he's becoming so powerful. I guess, how do you see the role of someone like Ellison in today's landscape? How do you understand it?
It's such an interesting opener because I think even among media and technology commentators and writers, even though Oracle is a really enormously important company in terms of infrastructure and certainly cloud storage and computing, he really isn't. Larry Ellison, who's 81 now, has really been very low profile. When you compare him to the Elon Musks and Rupert Murdochs of this world, I very much doubt if you showed most journalists a picture of Larry Ellison, they probably would now, but like a year ago, I doubt whether most of them would have been able to recognise him. And you're right, he's donated a lot of money to political causes, both sides of the Atlantic. But that's because the business of technology is such a political business these days. We saw a couple of months ago Trump having a dinner with the leading exponents of Silicon Valley. Everybody was around the table with him.
It's quite a remarkable image, really, isn't it? It is like something from medieval court.
Yes, it was like a horrible version of the Last Supper, where it's extraordinary to see. First of all, not just a collection of people who have, generally speaking, tried to tack a course, an apolitical course, or at least publicly apolitical course, so obviously bending the knee, as it were, in the court of Trump. But the other thing about it, which always strikes me, and this is, I think, where Ellison is particularly interesting at the moment, is how few of them there are. So we saw just this week the head of, I guess we're calling it the Department of War, the Minister of War, Pete Hegseth, former Fox News presenter, called back all the major, all the the military command. And there are 800. There are 800 generals. When you're enforcing that stuff, you actually need people and bodies. You can get the equivalent of that in terms of technology companies around a dining table in the White House, because you have Google there, you have Facebook there, you have, I think you didn't actually have Elon Musk there, because you could have had X there. You don't, the concentration now of control and power sits between, we've always known about the 5 companies, right, which is Google, Facebook, Alphabet, Microsoft, and the other one, which you'll be able to remember, that I've temporarily forgotten. But you should really have Oracle in there as well, because they are alongside Amazon. Sorry, that's the other one. Amazon. Yeah, Amazon. How could one forget Amazon? You should really add Oracle to that as well in some ways, because it has this. It really sort of acts as one of the 3 major storage cloud companies alongside Google and alongside Amazon. And Larry Ellison's got a 40% stake in it, so he's worth about $370 billion, I think, which puts him a tiny bit south of Elon Musk. But I think there was a point in the summer where Ellison wavered above Musk, who sits around sort of 400 to 500 billion. It put it ahead of him in terms of wealth. When you think about this is an extraordinary thing that has happened, which is not only do you have these very small number of people who control such a lot of cyber and cloud infrastructure, but they're also now and have always been to some extent shaping content and shaping journalism and shaping output and shaping entertainment. And that really is an extraordinary moment. So, on the one hand, you just said, well, we don't really need to know who Larry Ellison or his 42-year-old son, David Ellison, are, because they're just in the kind of, they're in the cloud computing business. It doesn't really have a cultural bearing or a political bearing on what we're, how we conduct our lives. And now they absolutely do, because they're going to be people who own more media in the United States than Rupert Murdoch. Remember him? Remember Peter when he was a power player in all of this? And I think that what some of us have been obsessing about for the last, I would say maybe decade and a half, couple of decades, is how the alignment of technology, media, and politics has really taken a dramatic shift, simply because of the wealth created by what you might call, Web 2 applications, and now AI, that all of that is in a kind of an alignment that wasn't there before. I hope that's intelligible.
It is, and what I think is fascinating as well is like what you're seeing. You talked there about power, and I think what we're seeing is this incredible shift in power elites. If you look back, say, even a couple of years ago, the connection, say, between the Davoses of this world, these people would go to Davos and kind of play nice with all these governments, both of the centre left and centre right, and kind of they really hated the regulation, but would kind of grin and bear most of it. They'd only push back. Really, if they'd try and push back, they'd hire lobbyists and do all the stuff that you would do. But essentially, they would see them. They were kind of on a par, say, with the kind of technocratic politicians. Now it really is massively different. It feels like we've taken a huge these are people with often with way more power than national governments. The ability to shift and influence discourse. Just a couple of weeks ago in London here, we had Elon Musk live, at Tommy Robinson March, where we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in the middle of London. Elon Musk is talking about either you fight or you die. These are huge, and this is kind of impossible, I think, in some respects, to imagine even 5 short years ago. And it feels as if those tectonic plates, as you say, about this relationship between media, politics, and technology, is really shifting, and the media side of it is one reason I really want to have this conversation with you now. That feels like it's becoming a really important part of it. Like Elon Musk wasn't a media player a couple of years ago. Ellison wasn't at all, even at the turn of the year, in any substantial way. And these people are seeing media in a way that maybe Rupert Murdoch did, but actually they've got another thing called technology that they're making a lot of money at that Rupert Murdoch didn't. And it just feels like we're seeing, like, you know, it's a very different landscape that's shifting quite quickly.
I think that's right. And you talk there, Peter, about how regulation was a key part of this. And as you say, the Davos set, when everyone would go off to the Glog hut at the Google compound in Davos. I speak as someone with some personal knowledge of that, which was this extraordinary sort of informal gathering of power. And that's in some ways why Davos put the backs of the Trump administration and other people who felt that they were outside of that or wanted to be part of it but would never be admitted. And a lot of that was about about a regulatory standoff or dance that was taking place between particularly Western governments and the tech industry. Because, of course, in China, Xi Jinping, he got this right quite a long time ago in terms of what Trump is trying to achieve now. You look at China's playbook, you look at Hungary's playbook, you look at what Putin has achieved in Russia. They've all been there for some time, which is you have to have no separation of personal, commercial and government data. You have complete control and insight into your media companies. And where you have the appearance of independent media in somewhere like Hungary, you gradually erode that by putting your cronies into the leadership positions. So the Davos set was a kind of manifestation of liberal consensus around this. But there was also quite a steely backbone of gradual regulation, particularly from Europe, that was moving along. And at the same time, you had this dithering, really, from Democrats in the US, who I think genuinely believe that these massive engines of wealth. So again, this is what happens when, I live in America. It is a capitalist society. And so when your largest companies are driving the growth in your pensions, they're dragging the rest of the stock market ever upwards. Even Democrats find it quite hard to step in there. So you had this rising tide of regulation, particularly in Europe, with things like the Digital Services Act. But in the US, you really had nothing. And you have to remember that the period we're talking about, you had 13 out of 20 years were controlled by Democrats. Not completely controlled, because obviously you have you had the Republicans trying to stop them getting any meaningful change through. But really, there wasn't a desire to regulate this sector until it was pretty much too late. And so, exactly as you say, Peter, what you had then was, in a really short space of time, this collapse between what had always been pretty much separate functions, like the separate function of just delivering broadcast signals or delivering the news. You had the business of things like cloud computing and control of sort of internet delivery. And then you had these people who are business people, and quite often, dare I use the phrase, nerds. These are people who were engineers and entrepreneurs who'd really very much come up through an anti-media educational and business framework. They didn't want to be in front of the camera. They didn't like journalists and fraternize with them. And then you had the sort of the lightning rod that was Donald Trump, who completely understands the media business, really is fascinated by message and control and appearance of things, And you had him weld, if you like, this extraordinary economic project and technological project, which is Silicon Valley, into his political worldview. And it didn't honestly take much welding either, because neither Donald Trump believes in a regulation which has people obey him. Outside of that, he doesn't really think much about, I think, regulatory frameworks that might benefit other areas of society. And in Silicon Valley, you have a prevailing mentality that says we know better than anybody else. Look at what we've built. And we've done it without any effective regulation, and that has to continue to be the case.
I think what's fascinating about that is it kind of, you can see it plugged in very neatly actually into a kind of a Trumpian worldview in some respects, and it does feel as if like what Trump also I think is showing, like, is it is kind of breaking up of what they call the administrative state. This is we're going to rip out all the wiring, and that's a very Silicon Valley mentality. Like the mentality that's driving Trump forward and that's driving like the kind of Project 2025 MAGA movement is actually in some respects that's move fast and break things. That could be a Donald Trump. That could be a Donald Trump election slogan.
Yes, I think he was move fast and make things great again, or the most beautiful they've ever been. But that's exactly right, which is there is an argument to say that friction is democracy in some of these processes, that rule of law, having to go through hearings in court to litigate whether some change is allowed or not, that's all part of a democratic process, and keeping the different pillars of government separate from each other and keeping them separate from business. And exactly as you say, that Silicon Valley, move fast, break things, remove friction is what every single engineer in Silicon Valley has been focused on for the past 30, 40 years. And the natural output of that is you have a bubble of people who are often quite monocultural in their thinking, not necessarily in their backgrounds, but certainly monocultural in their thinking, and who are incentivized really against two things, one of which is this frictionless world that you're talking about. And the second one is really the accretion of data and therefore the accretion of wealth and the speed with which you can deploy products into the market to make more money. So it's really this engineering view, which has been enabled by Wall Street financiers, and a particular model of financing, which is venture capital, private equity, again, small groups of unelected people with large amounts of capital to deploy that fundamentally change society. And I think, you and I were both engaged in this project some time ago of saying, but wait a minute, this is all going to come out in the wash when it comes to the messages that people see and that are put in front of the public and the way that discussion is shaped. And this is going to be a much bigger shift than just from radio to television or from pamphlets to radio, because this is a real blowing apart of everything that we know about control of the message. That might be thrilling, but it might also be quite dangerous. And now, again, all of this has happened in such a short space of time. So we've gone from the realization that this is going to shape all sorts of things about our politics and our world to the realization that that's going to happen in a bad way, like move fast and break things is not necessarily a good thing. And now we're seeing how it can be rolled up into a kind of techno-authoritarianism, which is really effective, actually, in two of the world's largest economies, which is China and America. And you have India and Russia, not far behind.
So what does that look like? Techno-authoritarianism in America today? Do you think things have happened quickly, but we're here. It's October 2025. We're less than a year into Trump's term. What have we seen, do you think, in the last less than a year? How fucked are we?
Oh, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, Peter, we're probably at about 8.5 right now. But that question about what have we seen just in the past few months, was making some notes on this. Let's go back to our friend Larry Ellison, who who wasn't really seen as being a major media player that long ago. Just in the past, so let's just go through a few highlights from since Donald Trump's election, because some of it really predates that. I think really the moment that Elon Musk bought Twitter in October 2022 was actually the kind of starting pistol for all of this. But just in the past few months, we saw, I guess, a really kind of critical moment was December 24, when Donald Trump sued ABC News and successfully settled a lawsuit against, it was a libel suit because of something George Stephanopoulos had said in describing E. Jane Carroll's lawsuit against Trump. I'm not going to repeat it here because I don't know what your resources are like, but who knows where they're going to come to after this. Then kind of quite quickly, that was before the inauguration took place. Then after the inauguration, you just had this whole avalanche of stuff happening. You had the Associated Press being blocked from the press pool because they wouldn't call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, which had been, and they wouldn't change it in their style book, which was an executive order from Donald Trump. You had executive orders in May, which were effectively defunding, taking $1 billion away from public media, from PBS and NPR. That was ratified by Congress in August, so that's now happened. We've seen the first public media outlets shutting down as a result of that. You also had lawsuits against other news companies, including CBS. So CBS had a $68 million lawsuit that they settled and paid Trump for, which was about the editing of an interview with Kamala Harris.
Which is quite remarkable. I remember this was the one that almost really I just couldn't believe. As you know, it was the most mundane thing. Frankly, it was like an edit. You edit any interview. This was. You know, there was really, of any case, I actually my mind blew up almost when I saw that one.
I think that's right, which is suddenly the little details of these really matter, which is saying it was deceptively edited. Well, it was an edited interview. It wasn't necessarily deceptively edited, but it made Kamala Harris maybe look better than perhaps Donald Trump wanted her to look. But every editor, also freedom of speech is about freedom to leave in and take out things. It's about the freedom of a technology platform not to carry something it doesn't want to carry. Or maybe if that technology platform is dominant, then it shouldn't be allowed to just make arbitrary decisions. But that issue about what constitutes free speech has been, oft litigated in the United States. But because we have the First Amendment, which basically says Congress shall pass no law, which sees the government interfere in the freedom of expression or the freedom of, and that isn't incidentally just, it's not just the press that's affected by that. That's for everybody. Everyone has that freedom. So the idea that the president would object and sue and win because of how an editor, incidentally a seasoned, respected editor, edited interviews, as you say, that is something that then triggers something which says this is a level of interference and coercion that we haven't seen before. So that happened again in in July. Then we had, in parallel with that, CBS, it's very important to say, is part of Paramount. And Paramount was in discussions for an $8 billion merger with Skydance, which is owned by one David Ellison. Hope you're all keeping track, who is the son of Larry Ellison, who founded it in 2010, obviously with his dad's money, made lots of big blockbuster movies like Mission Impossible and Top Gun. He's a very keen pilot, is David, so he's made lots of films with flying in them. And this idea, the idea that Paramount and Skydance would merge. So at the same time, you've got this lawsuit hanging over CBS, which is part of Paramount. You have Paramount and Skydance trying to come to an agreement. And what you have very unsubtly, in fact, absolutely explicitly, is you have the newly installed chair of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, making noises about what might be required to see this merge go through. So it will shock you, Peter, to know that when once the lawsuit was settled with CBS for the editing the interview, and incidentally, on July the 18th, let's go back because that feels like a very long time ago now, even though it's it's just a couple of months. CBS also cancelled Stephen Colbert, who's their late night talk host as well. And then after that, surprise, surprise, the merger between Skydance and CBS went through, but not without some provisions about how their journalism news had to be unbiased. They've installed an ombudsman who has a very unbiased background of being the head of a conservative think tank, a guy called Ken Weinstein.
And it might be worth mentioning at this point as well that Brendan Carr... there's so much. Brendan Carr from the is it the FCC? I always forget the initials.
Yes.
He wears a Trump pin. This is somebody who's supposed to be, and actually before Disney had sacked and then rehired Jimmy Kimmel, and the way Charlie Kirk, he said basically channels are going to have to we're going to either we're going to have to step in if channels don't say Charlie Kirk is a great guy and keep to that line, which is again quite remarkable. So much so that even Ted Cruz, who's hardly seen, I think, as a friend of kind of plurality, actually I think did say this is a bit much, isn't it, guys?
I mean, that I think is a really interesting thing here, because a lot of this happened, a lot of the Skydance Paramount stuff happened in the summer. And you just referred to Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Points USA, being shot in the middle of September. So the subsequent jokes, it has to be said, jokes made by Jimmy Kimmel, not about the actual shooting of Charlie Kirk, but Donald Trump's reaction to the shooting of Charlie Kirk, which is there for everybody to see on a piece of video. That ban, if you like, sort of really became a kind of if you like, the sort of the crunch point at the end of all of this. But throughout the summer, we'd had, as you say, Ted Cruz, when he's starting to say, wait a minute, should we really be taking comics off the air for this? We'd had the Democratic member of the FCC, who's a commissioner called Anna Gomez, going out in public, describing the merger of CBS, of Paramount and Skydance, as the final chapter in a dark moment in the nation's history. This is, again, somebody who never heard from, or very rarely heard from before, because their job is really to make sure that the FCC carries on running. And almost like the Kirk moment was, I suppose, the ultimate demonstration of what happens when you have really, first of all, an extremely febrile and violent atmosphere around politics. Secondly, you have this focus on what people should and shouldn't say, and is it loyal, isn't it loyal? And you have a moment where actually Donald Trump is struggling for maybe the first time in this presidency with serious problems with his approval ratings, not least because of all kinds of conspiracy theory and talk on the internet about his involvement in the Epstein files. Again, sorry, we haven't even had time to mention the $10 billion lawsuit he brought against the Wall Street Journal for printing what turns out to be a completely true story about a letter that he wrote in Jeffrey Epstein's birthday book. I said it's so mind-boggling. It is so mind-boggling, isn't it?
It really is incredible. And I guess at the same time as well, it feels like, beyond journalism as well, we've seen, phenomenal attacks on freedom of expression in public institutions, in universities. We're talking to you from, you're at Columbia. Columbia obviously settled a $200 million suit with the Trump administration during the summer. Is this what's going on with all of this?
I think so. I think we're all asking ourselves that over and over again because there's been a great deal of study of both this media landscape and the forces of authoritarianism elsewhere in the world, and particularly how the speed of delivery and the control of obscure messages and who shapes the algorithm, etc., has been something we've been talking about for quite a long time. And yet when it happens, what's interesting in America is how our muscles for reacting against or resisting this kind of thing are really very weak. They've sort of wasted through underuse. And I think this idea that the Constitution here would save us, that something that was a blatant violation of the First Amendment would necessarily be upheld as so, particularly in a court system which is run, well, it's dominated from the top by a conservative Supreme Court. I think it's the shock that a lot of what holds the Constitution together is both legal process, but also a kind of agreement that is the best way to do business, and that is what the Constitution says, and we're all going to pay attention to it. When you get a couple of figures, and I mean, I don't want to sound like a very old, I don't want to sound like a person who's as old as I actually am, but AI, I think, has made a huge difference to some of this. So when you saw what the government could achieve in terms of making sure that universities wiped any trace of what they call DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, off their websites. Imagine going through 100,000 educational institutions and having to decide whether they're compliant or not. You can kind of do that now in an afternoon with the right code. Doge was really an exercise in saying we can apply the tools of AI to switching off programs and jobs and funding instantly. Nobody has to write a piece of paper. Nobody has to go and deliver anything by hand. Nobody has to find a person. It's all there. We can. So I think that some of it is about focus and having sort of practiced the idea that this is going to happen. So you mentioned, Peter, Project 2025, which is the scary document about getting rid of the university system as we know it, clamping down on the media as we know it, which a lot of people read and thought, well, okay, so even if they mean it, can they actually do it? And now we're discovering that you can actually do it when you have wealth and power concentrated in a very small number of hands, and when you have an administration that is just going to ignore or run through the rule of law and the existing constitutional restrictions and test all of those, test them in law, test them in public, and actually move what people are expecting or surprised by. And I think that's been a very it's not all about the speed that technology can move, but I think that's a large part of it, that it hasn't really enabled anybody to think sensibly about how resistance might take shape and then effectively do it. You see it in some areas like healthcare. There are alliances in the Northeast now which are basically ignoring what RFK Jr., who's the health secretary, says, and putting together their own vaccination programs. Within media, it's kind of harder because that's a business. So you then look to the non-profit sectors and you look at the growth of non-profits. You look at the growth of people like yourself doing amazing work, but not necessarily as part of a formal newsroom. And you think, well, these are great opportunities. Well, a couple of weeks ago, again, just after the Charlie Kirk shooting, you had J.D. Vance, the vice president, saying, we're going to go after the non-profit foundations that fund a particular type of journalism. If you're somebody who's currently got a really popular and not particularly patriotic Substack, it's going to be interesting to see how long companies like Substack will fall outside this squeeze that's being put on them by Trump. At the moment, I feel like they're too small for him to bother with. He probably doesn't read many Substacks. But it just means that anything which is in this fast-growing business space that's reliant on the same kind of funding pool that everybody else is going after is vulnerable. I think everybody is vulnerable to attack at this point.
It does feel like that, and that feels to be very much like a central part of this idea that everybody can be attacked almost at any time. And what you then end up with is a kind of self-censorship. I feel like that's already starting to happen. People, I know from talking to people, friends in American newsrooms, people start to go, actually, do you know what, he might actually sue us over this. You know, there's an internal censorship that happens. And at the same time, what you've got is, like, I see this in British politics, like the radicalisation of X is actually radicalising our discourse. So politicians are looking at X and seeing stuff. So they're saying this is what's happening in the public. And I think that's something that we're really missing. I think, you know, when Musk brought Twitter, and especially when he started to really take a stranglehold on it and bringing back people like Tommy Robinson, Trump if he wanted to, but you know, Trump's always got his own money-making machine in Truth Social. But like all of that, like I think I found like the liberal conversation on that, which is we can't leave the public square. You know, we have to stand here and fight. And it's like, no, it isn't. This isn't Hyde Park. This isn't Hyde Park Corner. It's not a bunch of people like, you know, it's shouting at each other. This is algorithmic, and the extent to which that also like. I think people often take their cues from what they think other people think and what other people do. And it does, I think that's already, you know, there's a kind of chicken and egg aspect to it, but it's already starting, it feels to me, or already has massively changed all of the dynamics around that as well.
I think that's absolutely right. And we talk about this thing called the Overton window in politics, which is where you move the frames of reference from what everyone can broadly agree on to something a bit more extreme. Well, the Overton window doesn't exist anymore in the United States. It's basically the big hole in the roof. So anyone can say anything. There was a moment on Fox News, which I think has probably filtered over into the UK because it was so shocking. But if you missed it, it was there and gone in a second, where a couple of discussants were on a Fox News show talking about the problem of homelessness, and one of the guests said there was a series of extreme measures that you might take to clear the streets of drug addicts and homeless people, and one of the guests said, or you could euthanize them, and there was a beat.
So you could kill the homeless.
Yes, you could administer lethal injections.
Which is worth mentioning that there's actually a very interesting review by Richard Evans in one of the most recent issues of the London Review of Books about the Nazis' eugenics regime, which is kind of basically exactly what the Nazis were doing.
There's a very close relationship between parts of Silicon Valley and eugenicists. It exists in a lot of code and products that we've seen or had to endure being foisted onto us, like facial recognition technology, etc.
Someone like Peter Thiel, who we've written about a lot, actually, Democracy for Sale, right. the founder of Palantir, who's, you know, he's quite outspoken on views like this.
Right,
actually, I think.
Right, yeah, and I think that, you know, so the point being that you can't imagine it being acceptable for somebody to be on America's largest cable news channel and saying, well, one thing we could do is just euthanize the homeless. And for that to be picked up, I would say, by maybe a handful of outlets, as discussed on social media, people saying, have you seen this? This is terrible. And then 2 days later, everybody has forgotten. There's no censure. No, Brendan Carr is not bothering with that as something that shouldn't be on the air. And that's where you get this weird inversion. I mean, you mentioned, you know, the Nazis, which we're not allowed to mention now because that is actually, again, an offence if you're drawing parallels. But I'm not drawing a parallel. I'm just saying historically, when you look at the Italians in the 1920s and the Germans who were in power in the 1930s, that this age of electronic media that was happening through radio at the time, and this huge explosion in radio hams and things like that, and suddenly sort of governments thinking we need to control it, that the key propagandists of those times, like Joseph Goebbels, knew that it was very, very important that if you couldn't control the message, then you needed to really sort of shape the narrative by telling more and more kind of outrageous lies. You had certain tricks like dehumanizing small parts of society that you thought people generally didn't like or didn't trust. So if you see what has happened in America to the trans community, this idea that you dehumanize a set of people in society to the point that you eradicate their human rights and in the past eradicate them, this is all part of where propaganda becomes policy. And I think that's the thing which is truly terrifying about this, which is you get these what feel like grandstanding statements just to get eyeballs or to whip up sentiment. In this administration, you've seen a lot of those turn into actually concrete policies. And we've experienced that in the university sector. We're now experiencing it in the media sector with the closure of, as I say, NPR stations, the shutting off of funding, the hounding, I'm sure, of people who fund non-profit journalism, and the targeting of individual journalists and people who speak out, comics, satirists, etc. All of this is very, very familiar if you want to read even the thinnest history book about what happened in the 1920s and 1930s.
Which is a very dark prospect. And I guess I'm going to shift gears ever so slightly to kind of ask about, well, what is the prospects like for the UK, and where do you see with some of the media, the media landscape here? Traditionally, we've long had really highly concentrated newspaper ownership. We've seen a lot of changes in the UK media landscape. GB News, I think, being probably the most, there's an avowedly partisan television station, something that frankly is not really allowed under UK broadcasting law. But being in the US, but you were at the Guardian for many years. You've been a real UK media watcher too. Where do you see this kind of, in the kind of thing you're talking about, this kind of the tech media power and nexus, politics nexus in the UK?
Well, I think it's, so first of all, I think that you mentioned Elon Musk and his stoking of the demonstrations and also his stoking of the riots last year and his involvement in regional politics is just a signal of what is to come if you're not culturally and politically strong. And what I worry about is that it just feels as though the institutions in the United Kingdom that should be standing up perhaps a little bit more robustly to this are actually not doing so. So you see the Labour Party being increasingly... it's not so much just having a sensible policy around immigration. It's the rhetoric that's deployed around it. It's the idea that, hanging patriotic flags everywhere is a neutral act when in fact it's quite an aggressive act, I think. Even
this week, I was at Labour conference, and Shabana Mahmood, the new Home Secretary, and he was talking about, we're not going to scrap indefinite leave to remain, which is reform, has floated that as a policy. But all immigrants that come here will have to do various things. They'll have to contribute. They won't be allowed to take anything out of the state. They'll have to contribute more, but they'll have to do voluntary work, which is, is both an incredibly vague aspiration. I don't know how you would measure that, but it's almost like, it's leaning very heavily into the idea that people who come to the country are a problem.
And in your media institutions, you have years and years where the BBC had Nigel Farage on Question Time, on news bulletins. They had him when he had no political power at all, and he was interesting because of how his rhetoric and stance was pulling the Conservative Party to the right. And it does feel like it might be a kind of quite low budget version of what's happened in the United States, but the patterns are almost exactly the same, which is you have this, you have a kind of a massive gap in terms of the richest and the poorest. So I think we haven't really talked about that, but this idea that you actually do have a genuinely sort of dislocated society. And rather in America as in the UK, that's regionally concentrated.
I think in the UK it does feel like it's. I spent a lot of time in America over the years, but in the UK, especially post-financial crash, you've just seen this bifurcation. America's social net has always been a lot thinner than, especially than the UK's, but it does feel like that's becoming more and more prevalent in the UK over time.
I think that's right. And then you see the sort of platforming of views and normalizing of views. I mean, the question, though, about what can you do about this cycle once you've spotted it, and how do you stand up to it, and how do you engage with it, and how do you use the platforms? I mean, the one thing to say about the right in the United States is because they weren't really part of the media establishment, that Donald Trump was right about. The media establishment didn't really have very many extreme right figures in it. They built their own alternative media ecosystem, and you can see that happening in the United Kingdom at the moment. And then the question is, they've got a following and they've got an audience, so perhaps we should be including their views in as people who represent the nation. And I think you said this earlier, which is, people change what they feel they're able to say in terms of the environment, and sometimes they feel emboldened to say things that they don't even really mean, but that expresses a kind of anger on their behalf, like migrants are responsible for all of this, even though if you coolly walked through all of the data, you would find that that's not necessarily always the case, or even ever the case. But it stokes a kind of politics of resentment, which is really helpful for new entrants that don't have a constituency. So it was really helpful for Donald Trump. It's incredibly helpful for reform. And you've seen all of this happening in the States. You've seen it happening in parts of Central Europe, seen it happening in Hungary, etc. So what can people who are concerned about extremism do about it? It's a really difficult
this was the question I was going to ask you. What can someone who's saying, what can we do about this?
I don't want this to be completely dark. I think that there are bits of hope. So, for instance, we've seen some success in using the courts and law here to push back. We're beginning to see, as I say, in certain areas like media and I think in healthcare and in universities, just networks of those who are most invested in it, whether they're the professors or whether they're doctors or whether they're journalists, reporters on the front line, really kind of being very resolved to carry on doing their jobs. And the initial kind of self-censorship and disorientation, I think, gives way to people thinking, at the end of the day, people don't want their children dying of measles. People don't want this idea that everything they see is not true. People haven't forgotten what it is like to have functional services and functional.
This is a question I find myself wondering too. If you look at, say, Russia, China, even Hungary, frankly, these are states that, authoritarianism came out of states that did not exist in many real senses of states. China 100 years ago was a series of warring fiefdoms. Putin came out of the genuine version of anarchy, of free market anarchy of the 90s. Post-communist, Hungary is not dissimilar in some respects. That's the bit I do find myself wondering all the time, the muscle. There's some, is there a muscle memory there of actually, pulling a lever and something actually happening?
It's also, I just finished reading a book about the Munich Post, which was the last publication left really publishing anything critical in mid-1930s Germany.
When the party that we can't name was in power.
The party we can't name was in power. And what's striking about that is just how everybody involved in that ended up either dead or in exile. And there's a point at which where the forces are sufficient, that even the most plucky resistance is not going to work. And I think that it's no coincidence that just about everybody who was involved in the Second World War is no longer with us. And even those who are involved in more recent wars are now, even older than I am, put it that way. Maybe in the Iraq wars, the Gulf wars, you have a lot more kind of present memory, but it affected a smaller section of society. So I think that as there is no real sort of predominant historical narrative about this, that is when you start to see, again, the manipulation of a particular kind of memory vested in media. So nostalgia. I have a whole theory, Peter, that you don't want to hear right now about how the Great British Bake Off is responsible for all of this, because it makes us feel like the 50s, where you had people baking cakes on village greens with bunting around it, was a really fantastic time, which was not necessarily the case.
Not necessarily the case, actually. Most people lived in the village and had outdoor toilets if they even had one.
Exactly. So I think there is a muscle memory. I think that on the media side of things, understanding what the hell, what exactly is it that has happened, and how do you start to really deal with that environment as a journalist is very important. I was talking about 18 months ago to Carlos Dada, who's the former... so he's the editor of El Faro, but he's in El Salvador now. The whole of that newsroom is in exile, and he said something which I thought which had a profound effect on me. Where he said, politicians are outrunning the media for the first time. They are able to outrun the media in terms of how they get to people, in terms of how they can, that we're no longer the lens that everybody sees things through. And he was talking about, his country. But you can see that happening elsewhere. And I do think that, Trump has this unique background in America of being a TV star and somebody who ran a hospitality business. So it's that, how do you make people feel good with a certain amount of artifice, and how do you use your charisma to acquire power or ratings? Everything is ratings. So I feel that sort of in this new world where everything is on TikTok, etc., I don't like to call them legacy organisations, but the organisations who've been around for a bit longer, it's taken a long time to realise that actually that is where the power lies. It lies in podcasts, as you probably haven't heard of. It lies in YouTube. It's on TikTok. And it's a different type of communication way of interacting. So I think that there's a lot of catching up to do at a time when I feel that the kind of the pathways to catch up are being cut from under our feet. So, it's actually sort of what was previously the great enabler of media, which is lack of regulation, freedom of expression, etc., is being absolutely, sort of shut down as fast as it can possibly be shut down, or it's being surveyed. I mean, I think that's the other thing we haven't really talked about. But so China has a really effective censorship system now, where it's much less visible than it used to be. But that's because they can just kind of, they can survey everything. And, real news or challenging news tends to lie around on the bottom of the internet and people don't see it so much. They will pick targets to crack down on, but you don't have to kind of round up hundreds of people to do it. So I think that, we all need to learn how to be in that environment. You see now how TikTok is being used when ICE agents move into people's towns to document what's happening to immigrants who have been taken off the streets. There's been very funny set of TikToks this week from Portland, where my middle son lives, which has been described as war-ravaged by Donald Trump. And it has some problems, but it really isn't war-ravaged. And just people posting ridiculously idyllic scenes. So I sort of feel that the pushback can come in quite powerful ways, and through a kind of collective ingenuity. What you have to hope is that it's not too late for that we can get to elections, we can get to democratic process that will actually sort of, allow people to demonstrate how fed up they are, because they are fed up. I mean, that's the other thing, which is, I think the fastest rising search terms on Google in America of late have been help with my mortgage. People are not actually being helped by any of this stuff that they're seeing coming out of the Trump administration.
I guess one place I wouldn't mind finishing this. We spoke a little bit about this, but is back in the UK, and is like we still have, we've a Labour government who seem to be quite slow to realise a lot of these changes are happening and the speed at which things are changing. Is there anything that they think they should be doing? Like, if there was one policy intervention that they could do tomorrow, what would it be to, what does that look like?
Such a good question. I've often thought that one of the things that they should be doing is just putting money into education and regional media and supporting a public media backbone. Not to say that actually you'd be better off spending money on hospitals or other types of infrastructure. But it's really noticeable.
It's not that expensive compared to building a hospital, put it like that.
Yeah, so it's actually not that expensive. It is quite low cost, but it's really telling when I go home, which I was last week, to where I come from, which is northeast Lincolnshire, which is sort of heart of Brexit land. That infrastructure expenditure is terrible, but also, that things like the local press has just completely disappeared, or it's 3 or 4 really enterprising people working in a small newsroom trying to cover a very big county. And actually what's going on in the local hospital, what's going on in the school system, what's going on with the mayor's office, you've got this new Lincoln,
Andrea Jenkins, am I right?
Andrew Jenkins, exactly.
I saw her performing her self-penned song in a onesie. I
know, that's great. Well, I was going to say you're very lucky to have experienced that. But I don't. When you're a hammer, everything is a nail. I'm a journalist and a professor of journalism, and so I see a lot of this as coming back to just essentially just not having the right inputs for self-governance, discussion, etc. But to me, that's the one part of the policy area that I understand, which I feel there should have been faster, greater movement on. And also it's very telling that this is something that authoritarians always move really quickly to close down everywhere, wherever they are. It's, you get rid of independent public interest media as quickly as you can. You shut down, stations. You pull funding. Digging deeper foundations around some of that, rather than constantly sort of wringing your hands and saying, "Well, the trouble with the BBC is that everybody watches YouTube now." It's not. That I sort of feel that is a policy I would enact, which is to have a complete overhaul of public media, which did not necessarily end in there being less of it, but probably more distributed and better funded.
I think that's something I very much would agree with too, Emily, as you can imagine. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. I found this an absolutely fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it.
So glad you're working on this. It's such an important thing to be talking about.
Thank you very much.